This is Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 8. If thou seest the oppression of the poor and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, marvel not at the matter, for he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. I want to start off by giving all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rakah Kodash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone, who are the elders of Yasher Allah, and a sincere salutation to all you Akim, who are preaching this word and believing this word, and to the Akwath who are believing this word in all truth and in sincerity. All right, I've entitled this lesson Economic Imperialism. All right, and it also says the violent take it by force. All right, and this lesson is inspired by the term itself, economic imperialism. All right, as well as a few videos. This video in particular came to mind, as well as an article, because there are a lot of geopolitical things that have happened as of late that go and coincide with Esau and his wicked rulership. All right, for those who do not know, Esau Edom is the biblical nationality of the so-called white man. All right, whether they call themselves American, German, Russian, Australian, New Zealand, Canadian, Britain, British. Their biblical nationality is Esau Edom. And according to prophecy, Esau Edom would have a rulership and dominion. All right. And they would be the last ones to rule before the kingdom of heaven would be established upon earth. All right. Now, the reason I'm bringing this out is because Esau at this point is using what is termed as economic colonization. All right. The first time Esau's colonization, if you will, was through the violence of the sword. All right. Now, what we see happening, especially with Trump's policies, is a form of violence through economics. All right. The tariffs, which are basically methods of coercion. All right. And all of these things point to Esau Edom, the so called white man, being the wicked of the earth. All right. Really quick, before we get this video, this is Micah chapter 2 and 1. It says, woe to them that devise iniquity and work evil upon their beds. When the morning is light, they practice it, because it is in the power of their hand. And they covet fields and take them by violence, and houses and take them away. So they oppress a man and his house, even a man and his heritage. All right. And violence isn't just the physical overthrow of someone. All right. Economics can be used for violent purposes, as we're going to see. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to play this video.
We can reindustrialize our economies and rebuild our capacity to defend our people. But the work of this new alliance should not be focused just on military cooperation and reclaiming the industries of the past. It should also be focused on together advancing our mutual interests in new frontiers, unshackling our ingenuity, our creativity, and the dynamic spirit to build a new Western century.
This speech has triggered a global controversy, not just because of what was said, but because of what many believe it implies about the future of Western power. At the Munich Security Conference, U.S. Secretary of State called on Western nations to compete for market share in the economies of the global South as part of building what he described as a new Western century.
A new Western century. Commercial space travel and cutting-edge artificial intelligence, industrial automation and flex manufacturing, creating a Western supply chain for critical minerals not vulnerable to extortion from other powers, and a unified effort to compete for market share in the economies of the global South. Together, we can not only take back control of our own industries and supply chains, we can prosper in the areas that will define the 21st century.
Rubio's remarks quickly sparked debate across parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, regions collectively referred to as the Global South. The term describes a diverse group of developing nations with shared histories of colonization and economic struggle. Critics say the language sounded expansionist and revived memories of the colonial era, when European powers competed for markets and raw materials across Asia and Africa. Many argue that talk of competing for market share echoes earlier systems where trade eventually turned into domination. Some analysts even drew comparisons to the rise of the East India Company. Historian William Dalrymple wrote in his book The Anarchy that India was seized not by a government, but by a private company operating from a small London office. Rubio's speech also comes amid wider geopolitical tensions. Critics point to recent moves by U.S. President Donald Trump, including sanctions on India over Russian oil purchases and pressure to shift energy ties toward Venezuela, as signs of a more aggressive economic strategy. India has maintained that its energy security will determine its oil trade and partners. In Munich on February 14th, Rubio spoke about rebuilding Western industry, controlling borders and reclaiming sovereignty, calling America a child of Europe, and traced Western expansion to World War II.
Because for us Americans, our home may be in the Western Hemisphere, but we will always be a child of Europe. Our story began with an Italian explorer whose adventure into the great unknown to discover a new world brought Christianity to the Americas and became the legend that defined the imagination of our pioneer nation.
All right, and keep in mind the things that he's saying goes back to the scriptures. All right, he mentioned America being a child of Europe. All right, and I want to bring out this scripture because all of this speaks toward prophecy. All right, if you look at the timeline and the chain of events that happened when you think about America and how it came to be, it all coincides with prophecy. All right, real quick to touch the point that was made concerning Europe. All right, this is Jeremiah chapter 50. All right, and I'll start at verse 11. It says, because you were glad, because you rejoiced, O ye destroyers of mine heritage, because ye are grown fat as the heifer at grass, and bellow as bulls. Your mother shall be sore confounded. She that bare you shall be ashamed. Behold, the hindermost of the nations shall be a wilderness, a dry land, and a desert. All right, now this mother, all right, is exactly what Rubio's referring to. All right, remember, Babylon the Great, which is America, came out of Europe. All right, they revolted against the British. All right, which is why it's referred to as the mother of Babylon the Great, which is America, the daughter of Babylon. All right, because again, this was a British colony at one point, and America revolted against its mother, so to speak, revolted against Britain. All right, to claim independence. All right, when you deal with July 4th. All right, the Declaration of Independence. That was a declaration of independence from its mother, which is Europe, Britain. Okay. Within that, all right, you had, matter of fact, let's get this. You had other nations that were also over here. All right. That also tried to establish themselves in the Americas. All right. Now I just want to go through a general history of and how it relates to the scriptures. All right. This is Daniel chapter 7 and verse 8. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were three of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things. All right, now this is all in reference to the inception of America. All right. And with the inception of America, you had three other horns that were plucked up by the roots. All right. Those horns is dealing with the Spanish. All right. It's dealing with the French. All right. And it's dealing with the British. And these are all the adversaries America had to fight to push out of Babylon the Great. All right. So what you hear in Esau's speech, all right, Marco Rubio's speech, is really a call to restore the power that Babylon the Great, which is America, once had over the earth. All right. This is why when you go to Jeremiah 51, All right, I'm going to jump down to verse 8. It says, Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. Howl for her, take balm for her pain. If so be she may be healed. We would have healed Babylon, but she is not healed. Forsake her and let us go everyone into his own country, for her judgment reacheth unto heaven and is lifted up even to the skies. So what we hear Marco Rubio speak of is really a desperate attempt by the West to regain and reestablish power in the earth. All right. And this is why what you see happening with Trump, the tariffs, the sanctions, all right, what happened in Venezuela, what's happening in Cuba, all right, what's happening in Iran. All of these are attempts to reclaim domination. All right. And it all goes back to the history that Rubio briefly touched on. All right. When he talks about Britain being the mother of America. All right. And this is really a call to reestablish power. All right. And what Esau is doing, all right, what Trump is doing with economics in particular is basically a coercion. All right. It's basically using sanctions and tariffs to coerce um, nations like Iran, nations like Cuba, coerce them into submission without actually putting boots on the ground. This is why it's known as economic colonization. Instead of actually taking it by physical force, they're using their market share in the economy to bully countries into siding with them. And this is what we see. All right. This is exactly what's happening. All right. And it goes back to prophecy. All right. You have to remember Babylon the Great, which is America, is a country that was started through sedition, rebelling against their own country to become a nation built on robbery, rape, and pillage. And this is a 2.0 attempt at doing the same thing using economics. All right, this is why when you go to Micah 2:2, again, it says, and they covet fields and take them by violence, and houses and take them away. So they oppress a man and his house, even a man and his heritage. All right, and through the West and its conquest, the world we see today was established. All right, going into the beast being worshipped. All right, that image of the beast. All right, what is the beast? All right, it's the EU NATO system with America, the horse, sitting on top, utilizing the institution of NATO and the European Union as vehicles to push its influence. So that's the beast that you see in Revelation, the 13th chapter. All right, as a matter of fact, let's go there. All right, this is Revelation chapter 13. And I want to jump up to verse 4. It says, and they worshiped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? All right. And we're witnessing Esau, Edom, the so-called white man, utilize this Western power system, all right, to redominate. All right. And ultimately, this is going to force the world into a third world war. All right. These provocations are eventually going to force everybody into that full scale third world war that the scriptures speak of. All right. All of this goes back to prophecy. As a matter of fact, let's bring that out. All right. This is Revelation 11:14. It says, the second war is past, going into World War II. And behold, the third woe cometh quickly. Because see, all of this agitation, all of this provocation is eventually going to result in a response. See, Babylon the Great, which is America, is still operating off the confidence of what was accomplished in the past, their ability to bully nations without consequence. And we know, according to prophecy, it's not going to be so this time. All right. But what we're seeing is Esau be real savvy in how he's utilized the economy, all right, the global economy, to basically reestablish power. All right. I believe it was India that reestablished a deal with one of the European countries. All right. Which is basically America utilizing that deal to bring India onto the west side. All right. So let's real quick. I know I'm covering a lot of topics in a short span of time. So let me go ahead and grab some of the information that I'm bringing out. All right. So I want to go to Chat GPT first. All right. Now put in Trump's strategy is economic imperialism. All right. So it gave me a brief overview and I want to read a little bit. All right. It says why some call it economic imperialism. Said critics point to several elements of Trump era policy. Tariff pressure campaigns. The trade war with China involves sweeping tariffs aimed at reshaping trade flows and supply chains. All right. And that subject of supply chains is going to come up later in this lesson. All right. It says renegotiating trade agreements, replacing NAFTA, not an available entity type, must avoid. Oops, can't use trade agreement type, not allowed. Hold up. Salakia, let me jump down because I think this was an error. All right. It says why some call it economic imperialism. Said critics point to several elements of Trump era policy. Says tariff pressure campaigns. The trade war with China involves sweeping tariffs designed to pressure Beijing to change trade practices, intellectual property policies, and industrial subsidies. It says renegotiating trade agreements. Trump pushed to replace NAFTA with a new agreement, USMCA, arguing prior deals disadvantaged American workers. All right, it says sanctions as leverage. Expanded use of economic sanctions against countries like Iran and Venezuela to force political concessions. All right, challenging multilateral institutions. Frequent criticism of the World Trade Organization, including blocking judicial appointments, which weaken its dispute settlement system. All right, now I want to jump down because I asked it another question. I said, show strongest evidence for Trump's policy in economic imperialism. All right, so it's going to go into more detail. It says weaponization of tariffs against China. All right, what happened? Beginning in 2018, the U.S. imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods. The stated goal was not just trade balance reduction, but structural reform of China's industrial policy, intellectual property system, and state subsidies. Why this supports the economic imperialism claim. Tariffs were used to force internal policy changes in another sovereign state. The pressure targeted core components of China's development strategy. The U.S. leveraged its position as China's largest export market. All right, so it's showing that the American economy is leverage. All right, these nations having access to the average American consumer is what made a lot of these nations rich. China in particular. All right, if you think about Obadiah, the first chapter. All right, is Obadiah, verse 7. Matter of fact, I'm gonna just get verse 7. Let's start at 6. It says, how are the things of Esau searched out? How are his hidden things sought up? All the men of thy confederacy have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee and prevailed against thee. They that eat thy bread have laid a wound under thee. There is none understanding in him. All right. And when you think about America's relationship with China, at a certain point, the reason China became the manufacturing hub of the world is because the manufacturing jobs that once existed in America were shipped to China. All right. So, in essence, America really made China a global superpower because they shipped all of those manufacturing jobs. You know, when you had a grandfather or your great grandfather, mention that off a factory job, they could basically have their wife stay at home. All of those manufacturing jobs went to China, which is why they don't exist today. All right. And through that policy, China was able to get their money up. All right. They were able to build themselves up through that relationship. And this is why when you go into Obadiah and it says, they that eat thy bread have laid a wound under thee, there's none understanding in him. All right. Because again, now what Trump is trying to do is regain dominance. All right. Because all of those jobs heading to China, China has now become the global manufacturing hub. All right. So what Trump is using, all right, with the tariffs is basically a tax. So it's taxing these other countries to have access to the American clientele. And what this is doing is it's forcing these countries that are in the middle, that are on the fence, like India, it's forcing them to make a decision, as well as Cuba. All right. Cuba right now, I believe Cuba's under a blockade by America. All right. And that's to force Cuba into submission. All right, real quick. Let me see if I can pull up some info. Yep. This is from the New York Times, and this is a recent interview or a recent article. I'll just get the headline. It says a new U.S. blockade is strangling Cuba. All right. So right now, Cuba is under a blockade and it's forcing them because, again, Cuba was starting to have stronger relationships with Russia and China. All right. There's a reason that Maduro was kidnapped. It's because, again, along with the economic strategy, Trump is also using military strategically to regain dominance. This is why he took Maduro out of power, and he's in process of setting up a puppet government in Venezuela to have access to their resources. All right, they're also putting a blockade on Cuba. All right, to weaken the relationship between Cuba, Russia, and China, because Cuba's on this side of the hemisphere. So the Venezuela move and the Cuban move is to reestablish dominance in the Western hemisphere. All right. While the sanctions and the tariffs abroad are meant to force countries that are in the middle to pick a side. So if you choose the BRIC side, you're going to be taxed if you want access to American clientele. And it's forcing a disruption, all right, on the world stage. And eventually this is going to lead to conflict, all right, without a shadow of a doubt. All right, real quick. It says Cuba has survived 66 years of U.S.-led embargoes. Will Trump's blockade break it now? All right, and there's already been reports of blackouts in Cuba. All right, they're running low on oil. All right, nations are being sanctioned if they attempt to send oil to Cuba to assist, because this is all an act of coercion. Sanctions, blockades, tariffs, all of this is a coercion. All right, it's really bribery, if you will. You know, the scriptures describe it as a gift destroying the heart. All right, when you go into that word gift, it goes into bribe. All right, and this is just showing you how Esau is still a violent man, and he's able to utilize anything to make it a sword. All right, because right now he's using the economy, he's using the monetary system as a sword. A blockade, a sanction, a tariff is a form of violence. All right. How do we know that? Going into the scriptures. How can we prove that in the scriptures? All right. This is Ecclesiastes chapter 34 and 21. It says, the bread of the needy is their life. He that defraudeth him thereof is a man of blood. All right. When Esau talks about sanctions on Iran, all right, sanctions on Venezuela, sanctions kill people. You know, if you tax medication, if you drive up the price on necessities, the poor people of that country don't have access to it. So it's in essence, you're killing those people. All right, verse 22 reads, he that taketh away his neighbor's living slayeth him, and he that defraudeth the labor of his hire is a bloodshedder. So all of these economic antics that Esau Edom is is enacting, all right, is also violence. All right, make no mistake, this is still an act of violence. All right, because when we read in Micah the second chapter, when you see this discussion of the violent, they take it by violence. It's not just the physical sword. This is also a form of violence. All right, as a matter of fact, let's do this. Let's go to Micah 2 and let's get that word violence. So I'm going to read the verse again. Micah 2:2, and they covet fields and take them by violence, and houses and take them away. So they oppress a man and his house, even a man and his heritage. All right, when you deal with this word violence, all right, gazal, all right, it says to tear away, seize, plunder, tear off, pull off, rob, take away by force. All right, to tear away, rob. Okay, adding this extra tax is a form of robbery, which is what the tariffs and sanctions do. They make unfavorable business uncomfortable for these other nations, which is why Iran or India had to basically make a deal with the Europeans, because the tariffs that Trump has placed on them has put a lot of economic pressure on them. And this all goes back to a form of violence that we're witnessing Esau Edom commit globally. All right, when the scriptures say he ruled the nations with anger, all right, he turned the world into a wilderness. We're witnessing this. All right, this is Isaiah chapter 14:5. It said, the Lord hath broken the staff of the wicked and the scepter of the rulers. He who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke. He that ruled the nations in anger is persecuted, and none hindereth. So we're witnessing them rule the nations with anger, turning the world into a wilderness. This is why these nations are being backed into a corner where they're basically forced to fight. And that's a product of wicked rulership. All right, real quick, this is Proverbs 28:15. As a roaring lion and a raging bear, so is a wicked ruler over the people. All right, when you read that in the NLT, it says a wicked ruler is as dangerous to the poor as a roaring lion or an attacking bear. All right, because if you ask the average person on the ground in Cuba, in Iran, in Venezuela, what life is like, you're going to get a completely different story from what the average American life is like. And people don't consider this. People in Babylon the Great, which is America, don't consider the violence that is being carried out through these economic policies. All right, this is Isaiah 10:1. Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that right grievousness which they have prescribed, to turn aside the needy from judgment, to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. And this is what Esau is doing on a global stage. So when you hear a speech like this from Marco Rubio, understand the undertone. All right, this is a dog whistle. All right, this is basically them saying, without taking the mask off, that they're looking to reconquer, all right, redominate. And they're using the economic pressure to soften up the land, all right, for a grab. But ultimately, the Lord set up the Russians as a guard going into Ezekiel, the 38th chapter, and we'll get that as well, Lord willing. All right, so let me finish out this last minute or so of this video, and then I got one more article I want to bring out. All right, because a lot of things have happened in these past 2 or 3 weeks that really highlight Esau being the wicked and the violent man of the earth. All right, and we're getting a view of him enacting economic violence like never before. All right, this is really a blitz. When Trump popped out and gave all of these nations tariffs and hit everybody with these sanctions, most of the average Americans don't even know what sanctions and tariffs are. So they don't even know what the implication is by this guy doing this. But all he's doing is putting this pressure on these nations that are on the fence, and really, without knowing it, he's really pushing all of these nations into the arms of the Russians, because the Russians and the Chinese don't require this type of, they don't put this type of pressure on nations. They don't coerce nations. They actually try to collaborate. Esau doesn't. That's why scriptures say he ruled the nations with anger. All right, so let's finish this.
Our first colonies were built by English settlers, to whom we owe not just the language we speak, but the whole of our political and legal system.
He then called for a unified Western supply chain for critical minerals and a joint effort to compete for economic influence across the global South.
All right, now I want to touch a subject that she just mentioned, and that's the supply chain, right? Let me see if I can get to it. All right, so she mentioned the supply chains, right? Now, in recent news, we had one of the cartel leaders of the CJNG cartel, El Mincho. Slack if I mispronounced it. But he was put to death, and the U.S. intelligence helped. What a lot of people don't know is that he didn't get put to death because of the drugs. A lot of people don't know the cartel also extorts the supply chain going from the United States into Mexico. That pipeline, that supply chain, the cartels tax that. Not just drugs, but anything that moves through that pipeline is being extorted. And the government knew this, all right? Trump was aware of this, all right? And I want to bring this article out to support that, all right? This is from October 15th, 2025. All right, it says Trump's 2025 cartel FTO designations, balancing security and USMCA trade. I'm just going to read a little bit of this. All right, it says on January 27, 2025, President Donald Trump signed Executive Order 14122, designating Mexican cartels like the Sinaloa Cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generacion, which again is CJNG, as foreign terrorist organizations and specially designated global terrorists. This move, finalized by the State Department on February 20th, 2025, allows the U.S. to freeze cartel assets, block their financial networks, and pursue narco-terrorism charges. The goal is to choke off the fentanyl trade, with the CDC's 2024 update blames for over 100,000 U.S. overdose deaths each year. Those deaths come with a staggering 1.5 billion economic hit, from healthcare costs to lost productivity. The U.S. Department of Justice's 2025 cartel enforcement reports details 1,200 arrests, including high-profile Sinaloa leaders like Ishmael El Mayo Zambada Garcia, caught in 2024, showing the cartel's deep role in this crisis. All right, now keep in mind these numbers. All right, they said it costs 1.5 economic hit due to healthcare costs and lost productivity. All right, because if they're dead, they can't work. Now I want to skip down and get this point. All right, here's the point. It says, from an economic standpoint, the cartels themselves already distort trade and supply chains. They extort an estimated 500 million each year from industries like agriculture and auto manufacturing. While sanctions might cause short-term slowdowns, they also promise long-term benefits by weakening cartel financing. All right, freezing the assets of Sinaloa-linked shell companies, for instance, could stabilize Mexico's $3 billion avocado export market. All right, so keep this in mind, and a lot of people don't know this part. $500 million a year is just off of extorting the supply chain. All right, so removing the leader of CJNG was a it was a display of power. All right, it was a message to the cartels that, you know, this extortion game is coming to an end. All right, and all of these are examples of the play. The overall play that Trump is doing is a blitz. All right, it's a blitz to reestablish power and domination, both on the Western Hemisphere and on the global stage. And they're using the one card that they have before full on violence, and that's the economic card, which is why you see so much talk of tariffs and sanctions and blockades, because they're basically choking China's ability to get cheap oil, which they were utilizing Venezuela. All right. Venezuela's been taken off the board and now it's been reallocated to the West. And now they're positioning themselves to do the same with Iran. All right. But again, we know according to prophecy, World War III is going to play out. And one of the major players is going to be set up and is set up as a guard to these other nations. All right. This is Ezekiel 38:2. I start at 1. It says, "And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters and all his bands, and many people with thee. Be thou prepared and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them." So really, the actions of the Americans, all right, the Edomites in the West, their actions is really a billboard and a commercial of why you should join Russia. Because Russia doesn't treat their allies, their peers in the same way. Iran and China, that coalition does not treat their allies the same way. And this is why the Lord has set them up as a guard. But we're witnessing Babylon the Great in its desperation weaponize the dollar again, all right, through these sanctions, through tariffs, to regain power and coerce nations to their side. All right. Chat GPT, one of the second points that they made concerning the evidence to back up Trump's policies and economic imperialism says secondary sanctions and dollar system dominance, Iran case. All right, we just mentioned Iran in passing, but this is going to kind of hit it home. It says after withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, the U.S. reimposed sanctions, not just on Iran, but on any foreign company doing business with Iran. All right, this is an attempt to isolate them. It says why this is strong evidence. It extends U.S. law beyond U.S. borders. European and Asian firms were forced to comply or lose access to U.S. financial markets. The dominance of the U.S. dollar and banking system made compliance unavoidable. All right, so this is, man, they're weaponizing their market. So in order for you to get rich on a global stage, you really need access to the American market. You need the ability to sell to the American citizens. Because contrary to popular belief, even in a lower state, the American citizens are rich compared to the average citizen of another country, of most countries. So having access to the American clientele, if you will, is not just a leg up. In many cases, it's a necessity. All right. And they're leveraging that market to force nations to their will. All right. And eventually they're going to push nations to a point where they have no choice but to fight. All right. The last point that I'm going to bring out in this lesson, it says undermining the World Trade Organization. No, that's not it. Yeah, this is it. It says open American first doctrine. It says Trump explicitly framed trade in zero sum national power terms. All right. And I mentioned in a lesson yesterday about the scarcity mindset. Part of the scarcity mindset is zero sum. If this guy wins, you lose. All right. And basically, this is Trump's mindset. This is why his policies are so aggressive. All right. It says key themes, trade deficits portrayed as evidence of exploitation. of course, alliances treated as transactional, economic relations seen as instruments of national power competition. All right, this aligns with classical imperial logic, economic independence subordinated to national dominance. All right, it says why these are considered the strongest pieces of evidence. The argument rests on three structural pillars. So, this is showing that Trump's policies are more in line with economic imperialism, which goes back to prophecy, their attempt to build the desolate places and heal Babylon. All right, it says coercion. Other states faced economic punishment for noncompliance. And we've seen that through the sanctions and the tariffs, the blockades, the embargoes. All right, it says extraterritorial reach. U.S. policies affected third party countries and firms. All right. And this is against international law if you really want to deal with it. You're not supposed to interfere with a national nation's sovereignty, which is what Trump violated when he kidnapped Maduro. It was a violation of international law. But that's neither here nor there. All right. The third point says institutional dominance. It says control over global finance and trade rules was used strategically. So the dollar still being the most used currency, they're leveraging it for influence. And all of this again is a form of violence. All right, make no mistake, because Esau covers this up with bright $10 words. Make no mistake, when you peel back the layers, this is just violence called economics. It's just violence wrapped up in these fancy terms. All right, real quick, this is Psalms chapter 10 and verse 1. I started 2. It says, the wicked in his pride doth persecute the poor. Let them be taken in the devices that they have imagined. Because ultimately, this plan is going to turn back on them. All right, we know the elites are in control of both sides. All right, but what we're witnessing is prophecy play out. And we're witnessing the beast at work. All right, not just the physical violence of the beast, but the economic violence of the beast. As the scriptures say, ye are my witnesses. So we're witnessing the violence and why this system is going to be removed by the Heavenly Father. All right, this is Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 8. Because of unrighteous dealings, injuries, and riches got by deceit, the kingdom is translated from one people to another. All right, and we know that Esau is the end of the rulership of heathens. And it marks the beginning of the rulership of Jacob. All right. And the head of that rulership is Yahweh Shai, whom the world ignorantly calls Jesus. All right. So I'll end it here. This is 2 Ezra 6 and 9 in the G&T. It says Esau. Matter of fact, I'm going to do this. It says Esau represents the end of this age, and Jacob represents the beginning of the new age. So we're witnessing wicked oppression. All right. We're witnessing the perversion of judgment. We're witnessing why this has to be destroyed. This current system, this current rulership has to be destroyed. And then the age of righteousness will blossom from the ashes. All right. As a matter of fact, I'm going to end it with the precept that I started it with. There's Ecclesiastes 5 and 8. If thou seest the poor, it's like if thou seest the oppression of the poor and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, marvel not at the matter. For he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. Yeah, so this case has truly went to the Supreme Court. All right, so with that, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rakah Kodash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone, who are the elders of Yashar Allah, and a sincere salutation to all you Akim, who are preaching this word and believing this word, and to the Akwath, who are believing this word in all truth and in sincerity. Shalom.